It was the 1980s in Harris County, Texas, and my mom, not even 10 years old at the time, lived in a small, quiet neighborhood with her younger brother. Their house was cozy. Their dad, my grandpa, a retired special forces officer, always kept a watchful eye on the area. Life seemed simple and carefree, but there was something about that neighborhood that always made the hairs on the back of their necks stand up. Every day, my mom would play outside with her brother, chasing each other around the yard, their laughter echoing through the air. But there was one thing that always caught her attention: an old, weathered man sitting on his front porch in a rocking chair. He was there every single day, never moving, just staring at the world with a haunting, empty gaze. His house was strange too, run down, like it had been abandoned for years, with peeling paint and broken windows. Curiosity gnawed at my mom, but her father, always a man of action, seemed more intrigued than concerned. One day, after weeks of watching this man, he decided to approach him. My grandpa, never one to shy away from anything, walked across the yard and climbed the steps of the creaky porch, his boots making the old wood groan under his weight. My grandpa, trying to sound friendly, and said, "Hello, I'm Joe. I live over there." He pointed back toward their house. The man didn't respond at first, only rocking back and forth, the squeak of the chair filling the silence. Then, finally, he turned his gaze toward my grandpa, his eyes hollow as though he had been waiting for him all this time. The man said in low and raspy voice,
"You must be Joe. Come, sit, let's talk,"
he said, like he hadn't spoken to anyone in years. Now, my grandpa was no stranger to strange situations. He had spent years in special forces, so his instincts were sharp. Still, something about this man felt off, but he accepted the invitation and sits beside him on the weathered porch. They started chatting casually at first, about the weather, the neighborhood, but soon, the man grew more serious and said, "There's something I want to show you. Follow me." My grandpa hesitated for just a moment. His military training told him to always be cautious, especially in unfamiliar situations, but something about this man seemed almost familiar, like he knew things my grandpa didn't. Against his better judgment, he followed the old man into the house. Inside, the house was dark and smelled of mildew. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, and the floor creaked underfoot. As they made their way down to the basement, my grandpa couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The air grew colder, and the basement door groaned as it opened. The basement was dimly lit, the only light coming from a flickering bulb above. But what stood out was a large, old table in the center of the room, with a single plate in the middle. And on that plate, there are chicken legs. "Sit," the man ordered. My grandpa, unsure of what was happening, sat down. The old man sat opposite him, and for a moment, there was silence. My grandpa stared at the plate, and his mind was racing, wondering what kind of bizarre ritual this was. The man began to eat slowly and deliberately, his eyes never leaving my grandpa's. Despite the oddity of the situation, my grandpa felt compelled to join him. He picked up a chicken leg and took a bite. It tasted strange, but he ate it anyway. Once they were both done, the man placed his last chicken leg on the plate and pushed it toward my grandpa. He leaned in closer, his voice lowering to a whisper. "Do you want to see something cool?" The way he said it made my grandpa's stomach turn. Hesitant but unable to resist, my grandpa nodded. That's when the man's hand moved over the plate, swirling around it in the air. My grandpa froze, watching in disbelief as the chicken bones started floating off the plate. They hovered, spinning in midair, as if they had a life of their own. The old man smiled, and his grin widening until it seemed unnatural, and he said, "If you want this power, you must sell your soul to the devil." At that moment, my grandpa's blood ran cold. Something deep inside him told him to run, and without a second thought, he bolted from the basement, out of the house and into the daylight. His heart pounded in his chest, and his breath short and ragged. When he made it back to their home, he tried to shake off the feeling, but it clung to him. He couldn't get the man's words out of his head. He had to know more. The next day, he returned to the house determined to figure out what had happened, but when he entered the house, it was different. The door creaked open. The floorboards creaked under his weight, but there was no sign of the man. In the basement, the table and the plate were gone. But what made my grandpa's blood run cold was the pentagram etched into the floor, a symbol so dark, so ancient, it made the hairs on his neck stand up. The house was empty, abandoned, with no signs of life. He asked the neighbors if anyone had ever lived there, but they all told him the same thing. No one had lived there for years. It had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember. That was the last time my grandpa ever stepped foot near that house. He never spoke about it again, but my mom and her brother could feel the fear in his eyes whenever they asked. And the old man, he was never seen again, as if he had disappeared into the air. To this day, my mom still gets chills whenever she tells the story. Every time she recalls the image of that old man sitting on the porch, that strange invitation, and the dark power that lingered in that abandoned house, it's like it happened yesterday. And my grandpa? He always said he didn't believe in the supernatural. But after that day, he never doubted that some things are better left unknown. This is an old story, one my dad has only told me a handful of times over the years, but as Halloween approaches, it's been creeping back into my mind. My father isn't the type to believe in ghosts or the paranormal. He's a preacher's son, deeply religious, and not easily shaken. Yet, whenever he talks about this night, I can see it in his eyes. The memory still chills him to the bone. It happened back in the late 80s, deep in the woods of Harris County, Texas. My dad and a few of his friends often hiked through the forest behind our farm, cutting across creeks and animal trails until they reached the interstate frontage road. One night, they decided to take a different route, one that led them past a neighboring farm known for its exotic animals, including emus and other creatures uncommon to the area. It was supposed to be a simple adventure. Instead, they found the house. All 5 men, even decades later, describe it the same way. A crumbling, eerie old home straight out of the Blair Witch Project. My dad says that just standing outside it, he felt something was wrong. A heavy, unnatural stillness hung in the air, but of course, curiosity got the better of them. They had to go inside. The interior was frozen in time. A vintage cottage-style home that looked like it had been built in the 40s or 50s. But whatever warmth it once had was long gone. The walls were covered in bizarre Latin-like symbols mixed with English phrases that described a ritual, one that detailed how to sacrifice a human soul to some dark deity. Some of the symbols were clearly spray-painted, but others, my father swears, they were painted in blood. He would know. He later worked as a firefighter and had seen enough blood at accident scenes to recognize the real thing. Past a dusty living area, they found a narrow stairwell so tight that their shoulders brushed against the walls as they climbed. The stairs led to a small landing, then turned sharply to the right. As they ascended, the unknown loomed ahead. Whatever was at the top, they wouldn't see it until it was too late. The attic was the worst part. A single round window let in the moonlight, illuminating symbols covering the walls. But what drew their attention immediately were the chains, heavy manacles, and locks bolted to the wall, as if someone or something had once been restrained there. Dried blood had seeped into the wood, leaving dark, permanent stains. Then they heard it. A sound echoed from the stairwell below them, heels clicking against the wood, moving fast. Spinning around, they expected to see someone, another prankster, maybe a fellow explorer, but there was no one there. The house had been undisturbed, coated in dust and grime, and their own footprints were the only ones visible. At that moment, fear took over. They bolted down the stairs and ran outside, eager to put distance between themselves and whatever they had just encountered. But the house wasn't done with them yet. Wanting to prove to themselves that they weren't imagining things, they decided to leave in a different direction, using a compass to guide them. They walked east, but ended up back at the house. They tried the north and still returned to the front porch. They repeated this experiment over 10 times, walking in a straight line in every direction, yet they always ended up back where they started. Something didn't want them to leave. As panic set in, one of the men became dizzy, nearly collapsing. That's when he looked up. In the circular attic window, a tall, shadowy figure stood watching them. It had no discernible facial features except for 2 large, dark eyes. As they stared in horror, the figure tilted its head, shuffled slightly, then turned and walked away toward the stairs. That was it. The group sprinted into the woods, running until they reached the interstate 3 miles away. Even then, they had the unnerving sensation of being followed. Back at my dad's house, they tried to shake off the fear, convincing themselves it was all in their heads. But later that night, as his cousin went to get a drink of water, he froze. Outside, at the edge of the woods, the figure stood watching from the darkness. They never saw it again. Years later, curiosity led them back to the site. The house was gone and collapsed into nothing more than a pile of rubble. I always joked with my dad and would ask him what he would do if he went back and found the house standing the same way it had back then, trying to give him a reason to let me go and see the place for myself. But with trespassing laws being far more prevalent in today's times, it would be nearly impossible without either getting shot or going to jail, as it was not on our property. I don't know. It always gives me the creeps thinking about it, but I never considered the story to be true until I did this little mock interview with all of the guys. And when I say that these grown men are scared to death by this story, I mean it. Seeing them get physically worked up and frightened by just telling the story really caused me to be less of a skeptic. What do you guys think? Could it possible that they were just spooked and it caused them to see things? I want to start by saying that I grew up seeing ghosts. Spirits were nothing new to me, but they terrified me so much that by the time I was 7 or 8, when the energetic system becomes more individualized, I trained my brain not to see them anymore. I never talked about it with my friends. My family never believed me, so I figured no one else would either. This story takes us back to the early 2000s, when I was just a little girl celebrating my friend's birthday. She always had a Halloween party to celebrate since her birthday fell around that time. And every year, she would say the same thing. Her basement felt weird, and she hated staying down there alone. Well, when you have a bunch of 10-year-old girls sleeping over on Halloween night, a basement is the only space big enough for everyone. So, her mom and grandma set up blankets and sleeping bags down there, making it our makeshift bedroom for the night. Like any group of kids hyped up on sugar and spooky vibes, we started playing creepy sleepover games. Things like light as a feather, stiff as a board. And after the games, when some of the girls started getting tired, someone pulled out a Ouija board. Some of our friends refused to play, too scared to even sit near it. The rest of us giggled nervously as we placed our fingers on the planchette, asking silly, innocent questions. Who the birthday girl was going to marry, how old we'd be when we had kids, things like that. It felt fake at first, but then I asked a question about myself. The planchette slid across the board and spelled out one word, DEAD. The air in the room shifted. The girls around me went silent. One of them suddenly screamed, her voice piercing through the basement. She pointed at the mirror behind me and said she saw something standing there. That was it. Game over. We shoved the board aside and tried to forget about it, but I couldn't sleep. Neither could the birthday girl or one other friend. Lying there, staring at the dark ceiling, we whispered about the board. Was it real? Was it just one of us moving it? Was that girl really seeing things in the mirror? Then, the dumbest idea in the world entered our 10-year-old brains. Let's try one more time. We figured if the other girls weren't playing, maybe we'd get a clearer answer. Maybe the spirits wouldn't be so shy. Maybe we could make something happen. We pulled the board back out. It was close to 3 a.m. We weren't thinking. We were just kids, messing with something we didn't understand. We asked the board a question. If you're really here, prove it. Make something happen. We thought for a moment, then dared the spirit to wake up the girl who had screamed earlier, the one who saw something in the mirror. We told it. At exactly 3:15 a.m., make her sit up, look in the mirror, and say something. It was over 15 years ago, so I don't remember what we asked for this girl to say. All I know is we asked for her to look into the mirror and say it. 3:15 a.m. was about 20 or so minutes from when we asked the question. The request felt so specific, so impossible, that it almost felt like a joke. There was no way it could actually happen, right? We put the board away and sat there in nervous anticipation. We knew it hit 3:15 a.m. because her basement had a big grandfather clock that didn't ring anymore, but the clock function still worked. We were waiting and waiting and right before the minute changed to 3:16 a.m., it happened. The girl shot straight up in her sleeping bag, her head turned toward the mirror, her eyes were closed. And in the softest, eeriest whisper, she said exactly what we had asked her to say. Then she collapsed back onto her pillow, as if nothing had happened. We were frozen. The three of us sat there, clutching our blankets, unable to move, unable to breathe. None of the other girls stirred, none of them even moved. It was like the rest of the room was in a completely different world. We stayed awake until sunrise. And in the Midwest, in late October, that's a long time to wait. We got maybe 3 hours of sleep. The next morning, we asked the girl if she remembered anything from the night before. She looked at us and in confusion said, "What are you guys talking about?" She didn't remember waking up. She didn't remember looking in the mirror. She didn't remember speaking. To this day, I still think about that night, and I feel guilty. Because without thinking, without realizing what we were doing, we asked for one of our friends to be possessed. After that day, I don't use Ouija board anymore. Do you guys have any horror experience? Let me know in the comments, and for more content like this, subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching.